On the night of January 11th, 2009, air traffic controllers received a distress call from a pilot somewhere over Alabama. The voice on the radio was calm, almost too calm. He told controllers his windshield had decompressed, that he was losing blood, that he needed help. Then silence. Controllers tried to reach him for the next hour. Nothing? When a military jet finally intercepted the plane near the Florida Panhandle, what they found made no sense. The aircraft was flying itself on autopilot. No pilot, no blood, no sign of a struggle. Just an empty cockpit slowly descending toward the ground. The plane crashed into a swamp near Milton, Florida, and the search for a body began. What investigators found at the crash site would change everything about how they understood what had just happened. But before we talk about the plane, you need to understand exactly who trusted this man, because that is what makes everything that follows so much worse. Marcus Schrenker ran a group of financial firms in the Indianapolis area. The main one was called Heritage Wealth Management. He managed retirement accounts and investment portfolios. He wasn't investing their futures. He was funding his own high-altitude lifestyle. His clients were people like a retired school teacher who handed him her late husband's life insurance payout, and a couple 3 years from retirement who believed every word he said. He was credentialed. He was polished. He sat across from retirees at a desk and told them their money was safe. And he flew his own plane. In the world of Midwestern finance, that last part carried real weight. It said, "This is a man who has everything under control." He did not have everything under control. By December of 2008, his phone was ringing with calls he was not picking up. Regulators, lawyers, clients, asking questions he did not have answers to. He had been misrepresenting investment returns, charging fees that were never disclosed. In some cases, moving money out of client accounts into places it was never supposed to go. When investigators finally tallied the damage, his clients had lost over $1 million, money most of them could never earn back. The investigation had been building for months, and he knew exactly where it was heading. And in those final weeks, before January 11th, he made a decision that no one who knew him saw coming. He drove to Alabama and left a motorcycle at a location he had chosen in advance. He drove back, filed a flight plan, and scripted a distress call word for word. Then he set the autopilot to carry the empty plane deep into Florida, more than 100 miles from where he planned to land. Every detail was calculated to put investigators in the wrong place. Then he got in the plane and flew the route. He had thought of almost everything. There was one thing he had not accounted for, but that comes later. Somewhere over northern Alabama, he made the distress call, set the autopilot heading south, and jumped into the dark. He hit the ground in rural Alabama, found the motorcycle, rode through the night to a campground in Harpersville, and pitched a tent. He unpacked camping gear he had prepared in advance. He turned on one of the prepaid phones he had brought and waited for news. For 5 days, it worked perfectly. The FBI had nothing. The FAA had nothing. Indiana had nothing. He was, as far as anyone could tell, dead. And then he made a mistake, and simply, it is almost impossible to believe. Picture what those 5 days actually looked like. January in Alabama. 40 degrees at night. A man sitting alone in a tent in the dark, watching the news on a burner phone, reading his own name in missing persons bulletins. He could not call anyone he knew. He could not use his real name. He could not access his money. The life he had built, the identity he had spent years constructing, had ceased to exist. And in that silence, with nothing left but time and cold and the sound of the trees, something in him started to fracture. Meanwhile, 3 investigations were converging on the same point. The Indiana Securities Division was still building the fraud case. The FAA had dispatched investigators to the crash site in Florida. The FBI had been monitoring the situation from the moment the distress call came in. When the crash site team arrived, they found no blood, no physical evidence of a decompressed windshield, no signs of trauma consistent with a pilot injury. The autopilot had been deliberately locked on a southern heading before the aircraft was abandoned. Within 48 hours, it was no longer a recovery mission. It was a manhunt. They were 48 hours away from closing the case as an accident. And then the postmark came back. On day 5, Marcus Schrenker walked to a stranger at the campground and handed them a stack of envelopes. He asked them to mail the letters. One of those envelopes was addressed to his estranged wife. His marriage was already over. His wife had filed while the investigations were still building. He had lost everything before he ever got on that plane, and he still could not let go. 5 days alone in the dark, and he could not hold it together. The adrenaline of the jump had worn off, replaced by the damp, bone-chilling cold of an Alabama winter. 5 days alone, and the silence was already louder than the risk. That was the one thing he had not accounted for. Not the FBI, not the FAA, not 3 simultaneous investigations. A letter to his wife. The stranger mailed the letters. Investigators traced the postmark to Harpersville, Alabama. The FBI located the campsite on January 16th. They found him in his tent. He had cut both of his wrists. He survived. Now here is the question that this case will not let go of. Why does a man with a plan this detailed, this premeditated, this close to working, destroy it with a letter? Here is what nobody asks about this case. People who sustain this kind of fraud over years are rarely just stealing money. They are maintaining an identity, the credentials, the clients, the pilot's license, the image of a man in complete control. None of that was incidental. It was the whole point. The money was the fuel that kept the performance running. And when that performance starts to collapse, what breaks goes deeper than fear of prison. It is the terror of being seen as ordinary, not just a criminal. Something worse than that, a nobody who spent years pretending to be somebody. The fraud was not a detour from Marcus Schrenker's identity. It was the foundation of it. That is what the plane reveals. He did not just need to escape. He needed one final dramatic act, one last moment of control in a life that was slipping completely out of his hands. The distress call, the jump, the staged crash site, hundreds of miles away. It was not a practical escape plan. It was a performance, and like every performance he had ever given, it required an audience. He lasted 5 days before the silence became unbearable. Before he reached for a pen, he was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for the fraudulent distress call and the staged crash. He received an additional 10 years on the Indiana fraud charges. His clients never saw their money again. Some of them were already retired. Some of them had no way to earn it back. And while he was sitting in that tent reaching for a pen, his clients were sitting at home watching the news, wondering what had happened to their retirement savings. He had a pilot's license, a staged motorcycle, prepaid phones, a tent, weeks of planning, and 100 miles of distance between himself and the crash site. He just could not go 5 days without sending a letter. If you want to understand not just what people like this did, but why, subscribe to Grave Motives. Every case goes deeper than the headline, and the next one is already stranger than this.